Hi, everybody. I'm Tanya Pobeda. I'm a PhD candidate at Ryerson and York Universities in the Communication and Culture program, and I'm presenting to you snapshots of my PhD dissertation in process right now. And it's entitled, I Didn't See Anyone Who Looked Like Me, Gender and Racial Representation in Board Gaming. And I'm presenting this at the Canadian Game Studies Association annual conference. I'm so pleased and proud to be here. So this is an intersectional analysis of board gaming, both the hobby and the industry sector itself. And as we know, with that intersectional lens, I'm looking for power and privilege. This quote, intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects, informs the work that I'm doing. I'm looking for whether the racial and gender dynamics within board gaming the hobby and the industry is delimiting it as a cultural practice and as an industry sector. And the really big finding, and I'm going to start with like the big finding first, is that the labor of games design currently is very heavily skewed, overwhelmingly skewed toward the white and the male. So I looked at the BoardGameGeek portal and basically looked for the top 400 games in that portal. And if for folks who are uninitiated into the board gaming hobby, BoardGameGeek is basically an online repository of all things board games all around the world, and they're ranked by users. So it's a crowdsourced giant database. And I looked for the top ranked 400 games, and then I looked at who made those games. And I looked for the demography of the labor of that game design. And what I found overwhelmingly was at 92.6% that these games were designed by white men. White women, 3.3%, that they represented 3.3% of the labor of that game design. And BIPOC men, 4.1%. So heavily skewed to white male designers. And here's a couple of comments that I got from a very extensive online survey I conducted late last year. And this was one commenter saying that, our local board game convention is whiter than Wonder Bread, and the game designer club I attend has an all-male attendance 95% of the time. So I got 320 responses from very avid board gamers and industry professionals, again, late last year. What was really interesting about it is I got a lot of written comments as well. People were really desperate to share their stories, their concerns in this survey. So it was an incredibly rich data set. And what I'm presenting today will only be a very small part of it. The other thing that I looked at is the top 200 BoardGameGeek games. What can the cover art tell us? And I basically logged every single figure, fauna and human representation, aliens, dragons, everything. I basically recorded about 2,000 different images, and then analyze them against, is it feminine presenting? Is it BIPOC presenting? Is it white presenting? Is it male presenting? And what I discovered was it was skewed very heavily male at 76.8% of the figures that I analyzed. 23.2% were feminine presenting in nature. And again, in that top 200 BoardGameGeek ranked games, again, a very significant skew toward white and whiteness. White presenting characters represented 82.5% of the figures that I logged, and 17.5% were BIPOC. And, here's an example of the kinds of comments I got about representation in the survey that I conducted as well. I'm never going to see any Indigenous people represented as anything other than barbarians in need of civilization. I've stopped caring for the most part because if I cared, I'd be mad all of the time, and I don't have the mental energy for that anymore. That was an anonymous commenter in the survey that I conducted. Now, what's really interesting about that is I didn't look at negative representation in my analysis. I'm just looking for the numbers, the raw numbers. And what their consistent piece of feedback I got from the survey is when BIPOC representation occurs in board game artwork, it's very often negative. This is actually a chart that I created kind of as a homage for another survey or research that was conducted by Aaron Ryan of Cardboard Republic, who put together a analysis that basically found that you're more likely to see an image of a sheep on a board game cover than you would an image of a woman. And in this case, that wasn't true for my study. Of the 200 games I analyzed, there were fewer sheep than women, but in this case, there were fewer women than creatures that don't exist. In this case, aliens or other fantastic creatures like orcs, imps, dragons. Women were outnumbered by creatures that don't exist. Another really discouraging finding was that you're more likely to see an image of a bird on a board game cover than you would a BIPOC woman. And that was a very shocking bottom line finding from my analysis, that only 35 figures of the near 2,000 that I logged were BIPOC women, and overwhelmingly more birds than BIPOC women. So with the survey that I conducted, I really wanted to find out, how does representation impact the board gamer or the industry professional? And what I've got back, and this was basically me inviting people to fill out my survey who I don't think have been fully represented by other surveys that I've discovered out there in the wild, in publisher surveys or other research efforts. Overwhelmingly, the people who participate in those other surveys were white and male. And what I was looking for is women, LGBTQ, and BIPOC board gamers. And this is what I got back. And no one was excluded, by the way, from doing my survey whatsoever. Everyone was welcome to participate, but overwhelmingly I heard back from women at 54.4%. Men represented 19.9%. Trans people represented 12.2%, and non-binary board gamers at 13.6%, which I found really, really encouraging. I was very happy to see this kind of diversity in the participation. And the other thing I wanted to say about this is the people who participated in the survey identified that they're quite hardcore board gamers, that they play at least once a week at 70.4%. So the people who participated in the survey love board games a lot. The other thing that I really wanted to get is a real diversity of perspectives in the survey. And, you know, one of the questions that I asked is, what is your sexual orientation? And got a great diversity of responses. Heterosexual, 47.2%, pansexual, 8.2%, bisexual, 20.4%, gay, 9.4%. So the majority, a slight majority, was LGBTQ, which was great. And the other thing that I found really, really interesting in doing this survey is that it was a hypothesis that I had, that a lot of people with high amounts of education, high amounts of post-secondary education, really love board games. And so I asked the question, and this response that I got back was way above population estimates. So not, it's 2% of the population has a PhD. In this particular sample, 6.9% of the respondents had a PhD, and 28.5% had a master's degree. So very, very heavily educated cross-section of players. And I asked this group of participants, how do you feel about representation? And 83.6% agreed or strongly agreed, and the majority actually strongly agreed with this assessment, that board gaming has a problem with a lack of equitable gender representation in board game artwork. So that's a high degree of passion that they're saying that this is a problem for them, and they acknowledge that the board game sector and industry has a real issue with representation in artwork. And the other interesting finding was 80.2% agreed or strongly agreed, with more strongly agreeing that there's a lack of equitable gender representation in games design. I got the same amount of passion about BIPOC representation in artwork and in game design as well. And in fact, the numbers were slightly higher in that case. And the other thing that's really interesting about the survey is, previous surveys that I've seen online, other scholars that have conducted, kind of census style activities, have never gotten a very high degree of BIPOC representation in their survey responses. In my case, I got 20% of the survey respondents who were identifying as BIPOC. So I was happy to see that as well. Now, the other finding that I got was there's a wish among the people that filled out my survey that publishing companies would publish more games designed by women designers, and overwhelmingly strongly agreeing at 51.9% and 29.6% simply agreeing, but an overwhelming majority really want to see more games by women designers. The other thing that I got back, and this was actually higher than the amount of agreement for women designers, was BIPOC designers at 52.8% strongly agreeing. And it's rare to see that kind of passion. I used to work in marketing, and it was very difficult to get certain communities to do strong agreement on anything. But this is a degree of passion you can see in these findings. And then 28.9% agreeing with that statement. I wish more board game publishing companies would publish more games by non-binary designers. Again, high levels of agreement with that statement. Positive gender and racial representation in a game enhances my enjoyment when playing a game. Now look at that strong agreement at 60.4% strongly agreeing. That's passion. And 24.5% agreeing. So overwhelming, response in the affirmative to some of these statements. Now, the other thing I looked at, and I'm not going to be able to go into a lot of detail today, but I'm really happy to take questions, is I looked at what happens in gaming spaces. And this is one sort of bottom line or top line finding that I found very, very discouraging. I have experienced unwelcome sexual advances while participating in the board gaming hobby. And this is in conventions, friendly local game stores. And I was really discouraged to see this level of agreement. About a third of the respondents said, yes, this has happened to me. And there are other findings as well in this research. And again, what I'm trying to get to is, does this delimit the hobby? Does this constrain its growth? Does it constrain it as a sector? And the answer I will suggest to you, and I argue in my dissertation, absolutely yes, it does. Here's a great comment that I got in some of the written responses I got as well within the survey. And I really I thought this was very indicative of a wider amount of comments that I got. I absolutely love the hobby, and my goal is to share it with as many people as possible, so they can be shared and represented with a more diverse group of people. I strongly dislike the toxic masculinity present in many communities and the sexualization of women that happens in games. So this is the kind of feedback that I got from a lot of the respondents to the survey. And I'm really touched and so heartened by the amount of very deeply personal perspectives that were shared with me during this survey. Now, one of the other big goals with my research is I really want to start a dialogue with the industry itself. And I'm hoping to make a difference in terms of analyzing the sector and also creating a degree of accountability. And here's an example of something I got kind of out of the blue a couple months ago, and I was really, really touched by it. It's a game designer who created, it's part of the Set a Watchtail series. It's a great series, by the way. And Clarence Simpson wrote me on Twitter and in response to a TikTok that actually had been done about my research by 1 Minute Board Games. And he wrote that because of my work, my own personal experiences in the industry, I was determined to prominently feature a Black woman on the cover of my upcoming game. Thankfully, my publisher obliged. And this was really, really remarkable. And I have heard from other publishers who are very interested in the research and are interested in opening up a dialogue about some of the research. And I find that quite heartening. And I've heard, privately from some publishers that they're really looking to fix this issue in this sector. And that's a hopeful piece of research or a finding that I wanted to share with you. And this is something that also happened as I was, dialoguing with folks on Twitter. And I thought it was a really nice summing up. It was a tweet that a mom posted after an 11-year-old read Emma Vosson's Feminism in Play and Kishana Gray's Feminism in Play book. And she read it and said to her mom, "We need less games that are about cis white maleness. We need more feminism. We need more racial diversity. We don't just need one thing. We need more everything in gaming." And I really love that. And that's the hopeful thing I'm hoping to communicate to the board game sector, to the hobby itself, that it is being stunted, delimited, constrained by a very narrow focus on a very narrow slice of human demography. And they need to broaden out, diversify, and embrace more potential players into the board gaming space. So this is me. This is how you get in contact with me. I really appreciate your time today, and I really do welcome questions. I'm sitting on a tiny mountain of data, and I'm so anxious to share it with the world. Thanks so much.